His master's voice, Franck on recordings. Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Robert James Stove, and I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. First of all, an appropriate allusion to the bard. What's past is prologue. Familiar to the point of cliché is the description of journalism as the first rough draft of history. In similar manner, the recording studio can be called the first rough draft of musical history. To examine the catalogues of recordings during, in particular, the 20th century's first half is to procure a fresh perspective on composers' reputations. It's a perspective which invariably eludes those who rely always upon received historiographical verdicts. Throughout the relevant period in the British Empire and continental Europe, less so in the USA, gramophone records remained strikingly expensive for all except the extremely rich. In Britain during the mid-1920s, Elgar's Second Symphony on disc cost £2, more than the cost of the cheapest gramophone. This at a time when the average British weekly wage amounted to a mere £5. The needful economic sacrifices restricted most people's capacity for impulse buying of such records, and helped to ensure that music lovers acquired them because they sincerely wanted the music and/or the performances involved with them. Another factor increases the importance of early sound recordings, particularly those made before electrical recording procedures became the default mode from 1925. Namely, the enforced preference for small musical forces, since the prevalent technology's limitations made capturing a full orchestra, let alone a full operatic troupe, difficult when not impossible. Hence the frequency of vocal solos, usually with piano backing, occasionally with organ or harmonium backing. Hence, also, the use of smallish ensembles, even with Beethoven's symphonies, which themselves would often be cut. Even the celebrated Artur Nikisch 1913 recording of Beethoven's Fifth, falsely described by historian after historian as being complete, was in fact abridged. Studio exigencies obliged numerous violinists to adopt Stroh violins, instruments equipped with a horn and a metal resonator for attaining the requisite penetrative power of tone. These problems discouraged the frivolous manufacture of the recordings themselves, just as the result's cost prices discouraged the frivolous purchase of them. Given all the above factors, the early representation of Franck in record labels' catalogues becomes all the more impressive. As far back as 1906, his music had appeared on disc. The fact that Franck avoided both the gargantuan orchestral forces and the heavenly lengths of certain other eminent late Romantic composers helped Franck's discographic cause. One thinks of how the drawbacks of early recording equipment discouraged, and often enough prohibited, surveys of Bruckner's, Mahler's, Scriabin's, Reger's, and Respighi's, even to a lesser extent Richard Strauss's, orchestral oeuvres. Confronted with the demands on both executants and audiences, which, for example, Mahler's Eighth Symphony made, confronted, too, with the editorial chaos already bedeviling Bruckner performances, themselves unattractive rarities for orchestral managements outside the German-speaking lands before the 1950s, recording producers could be forgiven for simply not wishing to bother with this material. Franck presented such producers with no intractable impediments. This paper, it should go without saying, makes no pretense to encyclopedic completeness. A paper which listed every single Franck recording since 1906 would be of almost Wagnerian proportions. To this end, I've needed to restrict the subject matter of this talk to pre-LP recordings, and for the most part, recordings from before 1945. In a soon-to-be-published version of this paper, I brought the Franck discography more or less up to date. And I've also included full catalogue numbers for the recordings, numbers which on time grounds I've needed to omit here. The sole hope for the usefulness of what follows is my conviction that no incontestably significant Franck recording from pre-LP days has been left out. Those who object because a favourite performance of theirs has been slighted or ignored entirely are hereby urged to contemplate the sage advice of Gilbert and Sullivan's Coco, who said, "The task of filling up the blanks I'd rather leave to you." It will come as no surprise that the first Franck score known to have been recorded was Panis Angelicus, which in its sheer concision proved expedient during the unrelenting, almost half-century-long dictatorship of the 4-minute 78 RPM side. In a mere 2 days' sessions on the 6th and the 7th of November 1906, Quebecois tenor Edouard Lebel recorded Panis Angelicus and a scarcely credible 39 other pieces, mostly folk songs from France and from French-speaking Canada. Thereafter, Panis Angelicus continued to be a gramophonic favourite, though not always identified as such. Sometimes, as with the 1916 version made at Camden, New Jersey, by contralto Elsie Baker, the score was referred to as "O Lord Most Holy," the first line of the already standard Bowdlerized English language translation of Panis Angelicus by one Arthur Mayshift. This translation was commissioned to expunge the Catholic imagery of the original Latin. 2 years earlier, also for Victor, a far more prominent and glamorous soloist, the New Zealand-born Metropolitan Opera star Francis Alder, recorded Panis Angelicus with cello and piano. Acoustic recordings' handicaps, as regards capturing orchestral timbres, let alone the sound of an organ at full throttle, guaranteed that a few of Franck's secular songs, needing as they did no more than a singer and a pianist, entered the catalogues much more rapidly than one might expect in view of their circumscribed present-day fame. Like Panis Angelicus, these songs possessed the additional asset of suitable brevity for the 78 RPM medium. Nevertheless, when the singer happened to be Caruso, Victor spurned cheese pairing. Caruso's 1916 rendition of Franck's La Procession included not only a harpist, but a studio orchestra. Already in 1912, the operatic bass Marcel Joulnay, beloved of audiences at the Met, La Scala and Covent Garden, had recorded the same song with the Victor Orchestra furnishing the accompaniment. 4 years beforehand, more modestly, the comparatively obscure baritone Emilio de Golgoza contented himself with a pianist, unidentified, in what seems to have been the first Franck secular song ever committed to disc, Le Mariage des Roses. It was enterprisingly coupled with a song by Vidor called Le Plongeur. Hardly had electrical recording established itself as the industry standard than Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra undertook not one but 2 Victor releases of the symphony, an account recorded by a long drawn-out process between March 1926 and October 1927, and another recorded much more rapidly in December 1935. The best-known Stokowski version of the symphony, one regularly reissued on various labels, came very late in his protracted career. It came from 1970 with the Hilversum Radio Philharmonic Orchestra of the Netherlands. To accompany the 1926-1927 set, Stokowski also committed to disc an outline of themes in which he lectured about the music's structure while an unidentified pianist played relevant musical extracts. Victor, divulging a commendably prescient desire to adumbrate 21st century American identity politics, even issued a Spanish-language version of the thematic outline. This had as narrator not Stokowski, but the Mexican poet and diplomat José Juan Tablada. Where Stokowski led, French forces soon followed. Flautist turned conductor Philippe Gaubert conducted the Paris Conservatoire Orchestra in a 1928 version of the symphony. 94 years on, the sound remains surprisingly bright, while the performance avoids the longueurs apt to afflict Stokowski and many other non-French conductors in this music. 2 years after Gaubert came another recording, this time on Decca, which is still less remembered today. It has the Pas de Loup Orchestra led by a compatriot of Gaubert's, René Battant, the professional name, very suitable for a conductor, of René Emmanuel Battant, long associated with the music of his native Brittany. How appropriate Gallic directorial toughness in this music remained can be shown by the counterexample of Wilhelm Mengelberg and his Concertgebouw Orchestra. These forces can be heard in a 1940 10-side set, which in its waywardness borders, I would argue, upon unintended self-caricature. It's hard to dispute the verdict of New York critic David Hurwitz, who, on reviewing a 2001 CD reissue of the Mengelberg recording, lamented the consequences of the conductor's own caprices. He wrote, "Tempos pulled about like taffy, soupy string portmanteaus everywhere that serve only to reinforce the opinions of those who view this work as the acme of sentimentality." Unquote. That a brisker, more literal approach to the symphony already prevailed in Franck's adopted homeland, even before Gaubert and his conservatoire instrumentalists reached the studio, is shown by a letter which Sir Adrian Boult wrote in September 1947 to Franck's eventual biographer Norman Demuth. In this letter, Boult, who demonstrated his own impressive skills as a Franckian with his underrated 1960 version, recollected his encounters with a leading figure from La Bande à Franck. Quote, "I had heard the work once or twice before I had the great experience, somewhere early in the First War, of translating for Gabriel Pierné at a rehearsal with the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra. He also let me take his score back and copy his markings, although I found there was practically nothing of any importance that had not already been noted by the composer. He gave a very beautiful, natural and French performance of it, quite unlike the rather exhausting Russianizing of it which was often heard in London between the wars. I note that fact because I remember having quite a long and tiresome rehearsal with the BBC Orchestra the first time I conducted it with them in 1932. They were quite unaccustomed to a natural and direct playing of the work." Unquote. Pierné never recorded the symphony himself. Since he lived until 1937, he had copious opportunities to do so, with all the advantages pertaining to electrical recording techniques. Opportunities of which, for whatever reason, he never availed himself. Possibly those in charge of British and European record labels felt that with Gaubert and René Battant already in the catalogues, a third Paris-derived interpretation of the piece would have been commercially unviable, not least amid the 1930s economic crises. At least Pierre did give us, in 1929, the first ever recording of orchestral extracts from Siche with the Concert Cologne Orchestra. Some of Franck's tone poems entered the catalogue with a speed which their obscurity in our time would never lead us to predict. In 1929 and 1930, Albert Wolff drove the Lamoureux Concert Orchestra through the Redemption interlude and Le Chasseur Maudit as if he himself frantically sought to elude Franck's accursed huntsman. The results make several later, better-groomed recorded versions seem lethargic. Désiré Defoe and the Chicago Symphony could be heard in the orchestral interlude from Redemption, in Le Chasseur Maudit, and in some of Siche. All of these issues dated from 1946. From the 1940s also come the first commercial recordings of the symphonic variations. Yves Na, in a 1942 version with the Orchestre des Concerts Piernets under Gaston Poulet, preserved on poor quality wartime shellac, and Eileen Joyce in 1946 with the Paris Conservatoire Orchestra under Charles Munch. The description Orchestre des Concerts Piernets concealed none other than the Cologne Orchestra, renamed during the occupation because of Edouard Colon's Jewish blood. During the electrical 78 RPM epoch, Franck's chamber music fared well. I've listed here 5 versions of the violin sonata, beginning with the famous account by Jacques Thibault and Alfred Cortot. It still sounds pretty incandescent. Yehudi Menuhin, then at the apex of his glory, joined with his pianist sister Hepzibah in a 1936 rendition. World War II brought 2 accounts, a 1941 set from Georg Kulenkampff and Siegfried Schulze that understandably achieved only limited circulation outside the Third Reich, and the much more renowned sets from Jascha Heifetz and Arthur Rubinstein, which appeared in 1942, although it had been committed to disc in 1937, and the almost equally best-selling performance from Zino Francescatti and Robert Casadei-Su. Cortot also dominated the earliest recordings of Franck's piano works, with his 1929 Prelude, Chorale and Fugue and his 1934 Prelude, Aria and Finale from the same company. The wrong notes, which increasingly plagued the overworked Cortot during and after Vichy, are much less numerous with his supple, buoyant performances here. In the earlier piece, he makes Blanche Selva's rival version from 1930 sound, by comparison, a little phlegmatic. One splendid curiosity is Piernet's own rescored version for full orchestra of the Chorale, recorded in 1930 with the Cologne Band, but for some reason never made generally available. This is among Franck's most unmistakably quasi-orchestral inspirations anyhow, and we can only regret the fact that conductors of our time have no discernible interest in reviving Piernet's arrangement, which underlines the music's echoes of Parsifal. The 2 first recorded accounts, both 1928, of the piano quartet practically burn the floor. Cortot's collaboration with the International String Quartet and Marcel Ciampi's collaboration with the Capet Quartet. Both of these performances remind us, in their at times unkempt ways, of just how disturbing and radical the composition still seemed to performers back then, how little opportunity they had had to grow blasé about it. In 1933, the Pro Art Quartet accorded the String Quartet its first recording. It's unclear whether the performance's shortage of repeats derived from side-length considerations or from a more general pre-modern reluctance to observe such textual niceties. Franck's organ pieces reached the recording catalogues surprisingly soon, in accounts by Marcel Dupré and Charles Tournemire, mentioned here. Dupré performed Franck's pieces not on a French instrument, but on the organ of the Queen's Hall in London, which 15 years later would succumb to Luftwaffe bombing. Paralleling Pierney's rescoring of the Prelude, Chorale and Fugues central movement are the occasional interwar orchestral versions of Franck's organ output. The Grand Pièce Symphonique's Andante section appeared on a 1937 Philadelphia orchestra disc with Stokowski conducting. This transcription is the work not of Stokowski himself, as might be expected, but of the recording producer Charles O'Connell. Another Charles O'Connell reworking for orchestra, this time of the Pièce Héroïque, reached record collectors in 1942 by Pierre Monteux and the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. Again, it's a shame that conductors ignore these Franck arrangements these days. The songs of Franck continued to appear in catalogues with some frequency after 1925. I've listed 3 recordings of them that appeared between the wars. 2 of them, the ones featuring the singers Charles Panzera and Germaine Martinelli, were actually recorded in orchestral versions, conducted by, respectively, Piero Coppola and Albert Wolff. Clearly, neither recording producers nor performers in those days had any particular purist squeamishness about confining Franck's song accompaniments to the piano and the piano alone. Even a handful of Franck motets, sorely neglected since, made it to 78s, namely the choir of Périgueux Cathedral, conducted by Abbé Léon Belléme, and with a certain Monsieur Bon as organist, recorded in 1939 Franck's Psalm 150 and, on the other side, Dexterra Domini. A bit of agreeable online sleuthing led me to discover a certain E. Bon, who is listed as a musician in a 1929 telephone directory of Périgueux and surrounding regions. Presumably this E. Bon is the same person as the Monsieur Bon credited with being organist on the disc's label. So strong did the public appetite for discs of Pinus Angelicus remain that approximately a dozen different versions could be purchased, at least in theory, by the end of World War II. Internationally famous names in this connection include Beniamino Gigli, Richard Tauber, and my compatriot Joan Hammond. Yet none of these interpretations reached an audience anything like as big as the one which in 1932 had heard John McCormack, by this time elevated to the papal nobility, render Panis Angelicus at the Dublin Eucharistic Congress. Several 100,000 people attended the Congress's final Mass in Phoenix Park. This event, the newly founded Irish radio station 2RN broadcast internationally. 4 years beforehand, and not yet Count John McCormack, the tenor had recorded the piece in more conventional circumstances. The portamento heavy violins are like nothing to be heard from any string players in the world now. What's more, an almost fatal bout of pneumonia, which McCormack had suffered earlier in the decade, had coarsened his voice, above all, making it less steady at the beginnings of phrases than it had been. Still, much of McCormack's well-attested vocal charisma comes through. In particular, all young singers should aspire to diction like McCormack's. Each Latin syllable emerges from beneath the surface noise with perfect clarity. Note how he rolls his R's on words like termi. Sadly, I need to end my survey at this point on time grounds. But in conclusion, I cannot resist quoting from the recently deceased Robert Leighton, the Sibelius biographer who doubled as one of gramophone's longest-serving critics. During 1987, Leighton recalled his journalistic novitiate, when each month seemed to bring with it a new LP recording of the Franck Symphony. Leighton wrote as follows. In the 1940s and 1950s, the Franck Symphony had suffered from overexposure in the concert hall and on the radio, and as a result made this an unwelcome prospect. Rather to my surprise, I discovered that what I had taken to be a rickety old warhorse was pretty indestructible, and the impatience with which I had viewed it was, as often is the case, quite unwarranted. And so say all of us. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.